Today we are interviewing Kathleen Vanden Heuvel, who is the Associate Dean for Capital Projects, Director of the Law Library, and Adjunct Professor of Law at the University of Berkeley Law School at Bowl Hall. Kathleen, let's begin with a little personal history. Could you tell us a little bit about how you were raised and where you were raised and about your life then and today?
I would love to. So I am the oldest of 8 children, and I was raised in Madison, Wisconsin, so another great university town just like Berkeley, or very similar to Berkeley. And you know, I had seven siblings, 5 brothers, 2 sisters, and although I was raised in an academic town, my parents were not academics. My father worked in an insurance company, and my mother had 8 children and took care of us. So
mothers with 8 children in those days were stay-at-home moms for good reason.
Pretty much, although when the youngest of her children reached a reasonable age, she did go to work as a legal secretary, actually. So I spent a lot of my childhood taking care of children, actually. By the time I was 7, I was sort of a miniature mother, I think.
Sort of as an academic director these days, maybe you take care of children even now in some ways.
Well, there is some experience that I do, does transfer over quite well from my youthful experiences.
I remember when I was in my teenage years, our next door neighbor was the dean of the School of Law at the University of Washington, and I lived near there in Seattle. And Dean Stevens would refer to the kids all the time, and of course I'd look at those kids who were 23 and 24 years old.
Right, they looked like these wonderful adults.
I mean, they look pretty grown up.
That's right.
But to him the perspective was different, and I
Well,
remember when eventually it
it
reversed for me too.
Because we get older and older, and the students all stay the same age. So
yes, they have that
they have
unfortunate
that
characteristic,
yes.
or fortunate, I don't know which.
Yeah.
So you grew up in Madison,
right? And it was it was very much a university town, and I think it had a huge influence on me. I loved hanging out at the university. Madison has the best student union of any place I've ever been. It's right on the lake. You know, families go there in the summer, and you eat ice cream and watch the boats, and so I always wanted to be part of a university, and so I think that I came by my love of academia kind of because of that. I'm pretty sure that growing up in Madison is what sort of moved me in that direction.
Well, let's talk a little bit about sort of in your growing up days. You had to be educated and get certain degrees before you could become what you are today.
That's right.
Could you talk a little bit about that, perhaps where you went to college?
Yeah, well, I very first went to college for a very brief time right out of high school, and that was in 1969. So if you remember those years, the University of Wisconsin.
I'm afraid I do. They were wild years.
The University of Wisconsin was shut down. The invasion of Cambodia, the burning of many things, the National Guard at my front door, the tear gas in my classrooms, and so it was an exciting time. And so I left school for a brief period of time. I was the assistant manager of a liquor store right near the university, so and that was in the years when the drinking age was 18. So it was quite an interesting job, but I quickly realized that I didn't want to do that the rest of my life. So I eventually went back to school. I went for about a year at the University of British Columbia, and then I came to Berkeley, and I expected to start up at Berkeley immediately to work on my undergraduate degree, but they thought I was Canadian and they wouldn't let me in. So I had to fight for a year to get in and convince them that I was an American citizen.
Wisconsin's pretty close to Canada.
I know, but it was, so then I ultimately ended up getting all of my degrees from Berkeley, so I have my bachelor's degree in ancient history, and then my law degree and my library degree from Berkeley, which I did a joint degree while I was in law school. Bob Barron said, you should go to library school, and so I did. So that's kind of the extent of my educational opportunities. And I feel very, very fortunate to have encountered Berkeley at that time in my life when I wasn't really sure what I was going to do. And it's an amazing place, a lot like Madison.
One of the questions I often ask in interviews is, did someone play a particularly significant role in helping you come to the decision that law librarianship was your field?
Well, it was definitely Bob Baring.
I picked up you had some role.
I loved being an undergraduate at Berkeley, and I loved ancient history, and I seriously thought of going on to get a PhD, but I just wasn't sure if that's what I wanted to do. And so I came to work at the law library, just as a job, immediately after graduation. And I was a little bit older than the other students because I'd taken some time off during the war years. And I worked here for about a year, almost exactly a year, when Bob Baring left Washington to come back to Berkeley. He'd almost come here, and then he decided to go to Washington, and then things reconverged so that he ended up back at Berkeley. I'd never heard of him, had no idea who he was. Either it was before his rock star days, or I didn't know his rock star status. So he was just.
We all have to begin sort of the beginning of things,
exactly,
and he was
right.
Still sort of
fresh. He was still fresh, right?
Yeah.
And he came, and I walked into his office just to say he wanted to meet everyone that was going to be on his staff, and I was, at the lowest level of the staff. Sort of in one of those holding pattern jobs until you decide if you're going to go to graduate school or not. And, we just hit it off. It was like meeting a family member. He wasn't exactly from the Midwest, but he had very Midwestern sensibilities, and we became friends right away. And, I was fascinated because I think before he came, my view of law librarians was, well, if you've got a law degree, why are you a librarian? Is this laziness on your part that you're not actually practicing law? And yet, in the year that I worked there before he came, I got to know the librarians, Alice Yeomans, Ellen Gilmore, who works here now. And I thought, wow, these people are really smart, like they're way smarter than a lot of the lawyers that I knew, and so I had an inkling that maybe something was wrong with my attitude, but I wasn't quite there yet, and Bob totally convinced me that choosing to be a law librarian was a very positive choice. But I still expected that I would go to law school and and practice law instead. And after the first year of law school, he convinced me that I should go to law school. Well, I wasn't sure that was what I wanted to do. And, seemed as good of a choice as any, so I went. And I didn't hate it, but I didn't really like it. And I had, kind of encounters with raging sexism of the law firm interview process. And I went to complain to Bob about it. And he said, look, just get a degree. He said, I was the first person to get a joint degree in in librarianship and law. Why don't you be the second? And I thought, yeah, sure, why not? Doesn't sound hard. And so I took his advice. I applied to library school. I did a joint degree, so I was able to do it in the same amount of time as if I would have just got my JD. And I've never regretted it. I've always been so happy and so grateful to him for saying, no, really, it's a great idea. This is fun. And he did look like he was having a good time. So that is kind of how absolutely would not have happened if it hadn't been for Bob Baring. I don't even know if I would have gone to law school, but I certainly would not have become a law librarian because I hardly, it hardly seemed real to me. I didn't really, I worked in the law library just because it was a job that I could get. I wasn't particularly interested in librarianship at that time.
I have heard so many stories that are very similar to yours, including my own. I worked as a student at the law library, right. and went to college and went to law school. I was anticipating I would go into what would be considered the more traditional use of the degree, which is to be a lawyer.
Right.
And it was in my second and third year that I decided to, I was persuaded by the fellow who was dean at the time, a man named Tunks in those days. that, there was a real shortage of good law librarians, and he had watched my work in the library.
And he knew you could do it.
And he thought I would be
really
pretty good at this,
yeah.
and so
And
that
he was right.
Yeah, well, I don't
That's
know about that,
wonderful.
but I did all right, and retired some years ago. So
Yeah.
I have survived being in the profession a long time. And
Yeah, no, I'm
and really
amazed
had
at how
a
many.
wonderful time as a librarian.
Yeah, and how many times I encounter people with that same story as well, and it is pretty wonderful.
I only know of one of our colleagues who went to law school fully intending not to practice
Mhm.
and to become a law librarian, and yet he didn't have the library degree first, but he'd worked as a student
Mhm.
and decided to do this. So he never even sat for the bar exam, and he said, "I don't need it."
Why put yourself through
Yeah.
that misery?
Yeah.
I think I only did it because I needed closure. I needed to say, okay, I'm done with this thing and I'm moving on to this new thing.
Well, I
So,
guess in a way I was hedging my bets too, just
Yeah.
in case, so I would have it. And plus, I could tell those friends of mine who wondered, what do you mean being a law librarian? What's that? That I did have the option
Right.
of being a lawyer, at least I was licensed.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of truth to that.
Mhm.
Yeah, well, I know Bob Daring certainly has great stories about trying to explain to his parents
Yeah.
why he was doing this.
He mentioned some of those earlier when we interviewed
Yeah.
him for this project, and interesting to hear.
Yeah.
I was fortunate in that if my parents had any qualms about it, it never was
They never
expressed.
surfaced.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, and I also think that my guess is that it's more likely to be a surprise if a man makes that choice, whereas they're not so surprised if a woman decides to become a librarian.
Well, in a way, that's the stereotypical
Yeah,
truth.
at least
and,
in my generation.
and I remember,
No wonder.
in my own situation, there were only 4 women in my first
Mhm.
year entering law school class out of about 150 or so
Right.
of us. And I think only one of them graduated. And in those days, it was a lot of law firms, as you say, were
Oh, I
not
know.
really interested
Yeah.
in anybody but men. And
Now, one of the woman, Bobby Barton, who was, I think, either the number 1 or the number 2 ranked graduate at her law school at Berkeley Law, back in the early 50s or mid-50s, she could not get an interview. I mean, not even, and she was also an accountant before she came to law, and her expertise was in tax. Someone finally got her an interview by saying, her name was Babette, but she went by Bobby, and they said, Bobby, and as soon as she walked in, they said, oh, forget it, we thought you were a man. Legal secretary, yes, that's all we would hire you for.
That
So
was
they hired her here
fairly
as a law professor.
prevalent for a long
Yeah.
time. Yeah.
Yep.
And maybe it was why some very, very fine people came into the law library field.
Yeah, no, I
men
think
and
that's
women
right.
over the years.
No, it's certainly the women I encountered here at Berkeley Law, I would say, would have been wonderful law professors had they felt that that was an area to go into.
Mhm. Well, you have been recognized officially by the campus, not only as now the director of the law library after Bob retired, but you got the University of California at Berkeley Distinguished Librarian Award back in 1999.
I did. I'd almost forgotten about that, but yes, I did.
Things one turns up on Google search or
That's right.
looks through an old copy of the
Right.
directory, which there's still a few of them around.
Yes, there are.
Mhm. You want to talk a little bit about some of the things you've done in the profession. It's been an era, you've actually been here quite a while, even
Yes,
though
I
not
have.
so long as a director. You've seen an awful lot of changes, the coming in of digital media of
Mhm.
various sorts, the rethinking of just raw volume counts as a criteria by which libraries ought to be evaluated. And of course, a breed of student who've never known anything but computers that we have certainly today. You want to talk a little bit about some of those changes that you've seen from your perspective, and perhaps put your predicting hat on and
That
tell about
predicting
where you
part's
think the profession may be headed, and the next few years?
Yeah, that predicting part is the hardest part, but you know, I mean, I really, when I first came here, even before I was in law school, I became kind of the resident Lexis expert. Did not like Westlaw, because it was, early on, it was still just the head notes, and even when it you know, moved towards full text, it still took a little getting used to, because by then I was such a Lexis fiend.
Yes.
So you know, I was the person in the law school that everyone came to get computer expertise, which would be laughable to my staff now, I'm sure, because I haven't always fully kept up with all the changes. But you know, it was such an interesting time to be, you know, to encounter the law, because that was the very beginning of my career in law. It was before I even went to law school. I started learning Lexis and Westlaw. So I have always thought of legal research as a computer-based way, or that's the method that seems most comfortable to me. You know, I was a library fiend when I was young and when I was in high school. So, you know, it's not like I didn't understand indexes. I understood them really well, and I, you know, worked in the music library for many years, so I, you know, knew all about card catalogs and the complexity. So I never had a problem with that, the way that some of our students do now, but I never thought of legal research that way. So I think I'm kind of unusual for someone as old as I am.
You were really sort of the step forward, as opposed to the step back.
That's what I encountered. My first real deep work with legal research was to be the person who knew how to use Lexis, and then, you know, to some degree Westlaw when we finally moved into the 20th century on Westlaw. And at the same time, you know, I worked closely with Bob Baring on his advanced legal research class. I mean, took the class, and then I TA'd for the class, and then I just would sit in the class because I loved it, and then I helped teach it when I finished law school. And I loved his structural approach. You know, to say, look, forget about trying to learn how to do all these individual things. We're not going to be able to teach you that in class. Understand, you know, that legal publishing is substantive. It is the place where you're going to find out how law is put together. If you sit around and you try to figure out a theoretical basis for it, it's not there. What's there are legal publications, the place in which, you know, this stuff has been put forth. And so that just had a huge influence on me, and it's always how I've thought of how I've thought about law. I don't think about it the same way as, you know, people that study jurisprudence a lot, although I studied it a fair amount myself, but so that had a huge effect on me, and I watched the changes, and I could see the students changing, but I was closer to them than I think a lot, as I said, than a lot of people my age might have been, just because of this kind of weird circumstance where I'd come to work in the law library, and they kind of said, here, you figure out Lexis, so I did. And I do have a lot of concerns about the future of law and legal practice, but I also see people just, you know, encountering these massive returns of data and information, and just desperately wanting help and desperately wanting expertise that they can trust. And then I've taught advanced legal research now for so many years that I'm almost embarrassed to even open my. Sometimes I just feel like, oh, you poor people, I can't believe I'm subjecting you to me once again. But I am so impressed with the students and so heartened by how sophisticated their understanding of the problems are, and also excited about the fact that they come to the class, and it's not like I have to lecture at them and say, you know, if you don't be careful, you're going to make these stupid mistakes. And they've experienced it. You know, they've done 6 million Google searches, and they know what it's like to get back all sorts of useless, unauthoritative information. They know what it's like to try to pull up a multi-volume book in Google Books and, you know, get like, you know, I don't know, ads for things, and not, you know, be able to find volume 2 but not 1 and 3, and they've been there, done that. So they are very interested in knowing how to deal with those problems, and interested in the kind of the theory of organization, that I think we try to talk about. So I feel like that's, you know, in a way, my contribution is to law students has been to just work through that with them and kind of go on the journey with them.
Mm-hmm.
And of course I end up learning more than they do probably, but it's really...
Well, in an advanced legal bibliography kind of course, they're obviously there by choice.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So these are students who really do want to learn something that they haven't yet learned.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
But it's interesting you describe it. You know, one time years ago I was doing some consulting with a law firm, and the question was sort of posed to me, well, why do we need our library and our librarians? And I sort of picked up on part of what you just said. There's such a huge amount of information now becoming available. This was still a bit earlier.
Right.
And I said, in a sense, your librarians are like the sheriffs in the Old West. There's a lot of stuff going on out there, but they're the ones that can bring some element of control to it.
Yeah, no, the control, the expertise, the coherence, and also just the understanding that, you know, one of our faculty here, Pam Samuelson, is just an amazing copyright lawyer and academic. Her husband teaches in the information school. He's also an entrepreneur, a very interesting man named Bob Glushko. And he's written a book recently, or he's edited a book, written parts of it and edited other parts, that's basically on theory of organization. And he points out, you know, look, we organize everything all the time, and we do it kind of naturally, but there's, you know, there are rules, there are principles that we all follow, but they're invisible to us, and it's really important to understand those and know those. And I love the book because it so much celebrates what librarians do. Even though it's mostly an online book, it has the most detailed table of contents and the most detailed index at the back. And, you know, he really gets how all of this stuff works together. And I think that, you know, that's what librarians can bring to the world now, whether or not we're going to be successful. I mean, you know, we don't have a great track record always. I remember back in the days when Google was going to do its Google Books project, and there was so much talk about copyright. And one of my colleagues here, Michael Levy, and I, back in the mid-90s, we put on two conferences 2 years in a row about copyright in the public interest and the importance of, you know, thinking about it in the public interest. But librarians we haven't done a great job of taking kind of, I don't know, credit for it is the wrong word, but we haven't really played enough of a leadership role. And, you know, for a variety of reasons, including that, you know, it's hard for us to play a leadership role because people don't naturally think of us that way. But I really feel like we've kind of missed the boat because we tend to be too obsessive about some of the detail, and we get too protective of all of our little, no, we have to do it this way because otherwise everything, you know, the whole world will be chaos.
I'm afraid is sort of human nature.
Well, it is human nature,
Yes,
but it's shooting ourselves in the foot.
You're
because Google Books, you know, of course, these were young, arrogant, naive people but they had tremendous enthusiasm. And rather, you know, we didn't do a good job of explaining to them why, when they're making, you know, all of these scans of books, that they need to pay attention to some other things. Instead, we made them think we were just silly and ridiculous by overemphasizing certain things. And so I feel like we missed the boat there, and I hope we still have a chance, because I think librarians could bring so much to things like the Google Books project. But so far, you know, there's been this huge divide where the Google people just don't understand what we're talking about. And we look at what they've done and we're like, oh my God, but how could you miss that opportunity to, you know, to bring things together so that people could find all of the books by one author, or, you know, just that kind of goofy stuff that we do. And Paul Duguid at the Information School once said that, you know, that Google always characterized librarians as naive and kind of, you know, silly. And he said, but, you know, it's really, librarians are the ones that kind of get what difficult things books are, and that, you know, it's not the same as just digitizing. or creating digital information. It's different, and but we didn't do a great job of injecting ourselves, and maybe it was hopeless. It probably was, but I always feel sort of sad about
as you
that.
say, they were naive, arrogant.
No, I don't mean that in such a negative way. It was a wonderful
look what
thing
they
about
have accomplished.
yeah, no, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so amazing.
And
but
if we could work with them, perhaps,
well, that was right.
we could. Everybody could benefit more.
Right.
By
that's what I
the expertise
wished.
that would then come together.
That's what I wished so much at the time, but I couldn't figure out the language to do that, and you know, maybe it just takes time to develop that language. But of course, now the Google Book Project already happened,
Yeah.
and they're not going to go back and do that again. And so it's on the other hand, it may be full employment for librarians in the future. So I can't complain too much.
Yeah. Well, let's certainly hope so.
I hope so too, because it's a great profession, and I would love it to be something that people can do more in the future.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Perhaps as we near the end of the interview, it's customary for me to ask if you, as the person being interviewed, is there anything you'd want to mention that we have not talked about?
Well, I guess one thing I'd want to mention, and this is very personal to me, you know, my career took a slightly different trajectory that I hadn't expected. I, you know, became the Associate Dean for Capital Projects, and I oversaw the building of this building, and, you know, that's not kind of a traditional thing for librarians to do, but I really do feel that my experience as a librarian made it more possible to do this, and to do it in a way that, you know, not that everything turned out exactly the way I would have wanted it to. It was a very fast-track project, and decisions were being made like that, and I'm not...
And trade-offs on resources.
Exactly,
Oh, yeah.
trade-offs on resources, and, you know, I would not say that I made all the right choices, but I feel like, you know, it was overall a very successful project, and I really feel... A lot of times, you know, I mean, I'm involved with at least significant aspects of the running of the school because of the space issues and the facilities issues, and I really feel, you know, that the original Rosamund Parma, the original first librarian at Berkeley Law, then it was just University of California Berkeley School of Law.
Yeah.
She really ran a huge number of the departments in the school, and I think there's something, it's not law librarians in particular, it's just librarians bring to administration, running of things. I feel like we could do a lot more for law schools, that in addition to doing the more traditional information gathering and saving and retrieving, that what librarians could bring to schools could really, you know, not save the schools, but could help so much in these you know, times of trouble as the financial aspects of the schools change. And so I really would like to see so much more involvement of librarians in the running of the school, because I think librarians have that kind of ability to pull information from all of these different places, and that's what people need. They need to know, you know, what's going. Like, we have all of these atomized, wonderful things going on in the school, but nothing to bring them all together. And you know, I feel like libraries could almost be like dashboards for the school. And so that's, you know, that's something I think my experience as a capital projects person really has brought. I always felt it. You know, and I always felt an affinity with Rosamund Parma. Probably it's because I'm the oldest of 8 children, and I'm just always bossing everybody around.
A take charge person, just pecking order.
But it's more like just make things work, you know. I think librarians have that more than anybody else.
Well, I think you're right, Kathleen. We tend to be fairly organized, very systematic, and that lends itself to an awful lot of the needs that the place has,
I think that's
in
right.
helping to resolve and meet those needs.
Yeah, so I think that would be
many
the
of our
thing I'd
colleagues,
like
you
to
know,
see.
have become involved.
Right.
And,
No, I know they have.
Well, you have with the capital project.
Right. No, well, and Bob Baring was
Bob
the interim dean.
was dean for a while.
Did he tell you the story of I was sitting next to him at a faculty meeting, and we were in a crisis mode, and we had to find someone, and I said, Bob, you're the only person that can do this. Mm-hmm. And he said, that's ridiculous, Kathleen. And I said, no, I'm not kidding. Really, the students want you, a lot of the faculty, you're the person, in this moment, you're the person who can do it. Mm-hmm. And he said, I have as much chance of becoming dean of this law school as my cat Louie has. Mm-hmm. And the next day, he got named dean.
So everybody's been calling Louie Dean Louie now.
That's right. Whenever I see that cat, I feel like, whoa.
Yeah. Well, and I hear stories, and I've seen in many other places where the librarian has become part of the establishment or the shakers or whatever you want to call it.
Well, I think it's the same thing that impels us to go into the profession. We don't like to see things done wrong. We don't like to see things done in a disorganized way. We don't like things to we want people to take their jobs seriously and be responsible, and I don't know how, and almost always the people who work in law libraries or in libraries in general tend to be those kind of people. And so, that's an incredibly valuable thing, I think. And I don't know if it translates well to the bigger world or not, but...
Well, it probably does for many.
Well, it did for Rosamund Parma, that's for sure.
And I think for a few of the rest of you here. And that's good. Well, I certainly want to thank you for taking a few minutes this afternoon and talking with us. And I look forward to seeing you from time to time at meetings now.
That's right.
And I'm able to start going back to a few of them after being away a few years. Mm-hmm. And, maybe we'll see each other up in Seattle in about 2 weeks when the annual meeting is there.
Unless something goes wrong and plans go awry, I plan to be there. So
you don't need an earthquake or something between now and then. You'll have to be sitting here talking about fixing whatever needs to be fixed.
I wasn't even thinking of that. Don't even say that. But if you are in an earthquake, you want to be down in the new part of the school and not in the old part. So this is the best part.
The new part is properly put together.
Well, the new part is better. The rest of the school is pretty solid, but this is much better.
Yeah,
so. Or at least in theory it is.
The old building has withstood a few of them.
It has withstood, yes. But we are half a block from the Hayward Fault. So if one hits on the Hayward Fault,
you're going to feel it.
You're going to feel it. That's right.
Very good.
Well, thank you very much.